Hello! Today I'm taking a look at the character of Rufus Shinra, the enigmatic and morally wayward heir to the Shinra Empire, and prominent villain, or arguably anti-villain, in the events of Final Fantasy VII. Now, Rufus is someone I didn't touch on too thoroughly, if at all, in my original Final Fantasy VII review, and even among the wider fanbase, conversation is often focused on the macro events and antagonism between Cloudstrife and Sephiroth, rather than the machinations of secondary and tertiary antagonists within Shinra. But I've always found Rufus an interesting component to the game and story, particularly if we account for his development and characterization in subsequent installments of the Final Fantasy VII compilation. From the outset of the first game, he materializes from nowhere as a somewhat obtuse and ambiguous bad guy, and a persistent question mark and debate looms over his aims and intentions over the course of the series, particularly his supposed change of heart by the time Advent Children and Dirge of Cerberus rolls around. As such, while I usually only discuss characters, and particularly Final Fantasy characters, within the confines of their core numerical game and setting, in the case of Rufus, much of the intrigue and progression of his character does emerge in the events of Advent Children, and his background is likewise addressed in the frustratingly Japan-only and now defunct prequel release Before Crisis, rather than the main game. So, where necessary, I will touch on these supplementary materials. But let's turn now and delve into the characteristics, the story, and the psychology of heir apparent President Shinra. So, as I've mentioned, Rufus appears as if from nowhere in the events of Final Fantasy VII, and narrative-wise, it's a really nice development to the game story, because, to recap briefly on game events, we've just discovered President Shinra impaled on the Masamune sword, and while this is quite a haunting and eerie game segment within the bloodied, empty hallways of Shinra Tower, there's still a sense of relief that the president of this evil empire is dead, perhaps offering a glimmer of hope that the Shinra is done, perhaps allowing us to focus solely on Sephiroth, and indeed at this moment even Barrett is pondering whether Sephiroth is somehow a good guy because he has, offed one of the main guys of Shinra. So, in the midst of this confusion, Rufus arrives by helicopter as a complete curveball and unknown quantity to the party and events thus far. A brief interlude proceeds, and before we're introduced to him, various anecdotes are told by the party, such as he's never been seen to bleed or cry, is he like his father or not? And apparently he's been stationed overseas for a long time. And this immediately builds an enigma and a mystique around him through hearsay. And for my part, I really enjoyed the mystery surrounding his past that's built up here, but Square have opted to expand upon in Before Crisis. And it's an interesting subject of discussion, because as I mentioned in my Final Fantasy VII review, I liked the mystique and the mystery surrounding Zack Fair in this game as well. And instead of leaving these as ambiguous facets of the past, Square opted to expand on Zack in Crisis Core. And I suppose it's just a matter of preference as to whether you like certain character stories being left unsaid and ambiguous, or whether you like playing through these fleshed out retrospective prequels. So, regarding Rufus's past, he has indeed been stationed overseas for a long time, and this is due to his attempts to overthrow his father by funding Avalanche during the events of Before Crisis. Final Fantasy VII proper is consistent with this strained father-son relationship, as upon meeting him, he doesn't seem very bothered that his father's just been murdered. We also find that Rufus is entirely at odds with his father ideologically, but equally ruthless, if not more so, when it comes to matters of business, which is another early insight into how this character is going to play out. His proclamation of governing through fear rather than propaganda, and the illusion of safety, which his father relied upon, shows the distinctions between Rufus and Shinra Senior, and where his father used business acumen, manipulation, and public relations to build and maintain Shinra's foothold in world affairs, it seems Rufus is much more brash and content to lie on threats, force, and an iron fist when it comes to leadership. So in any other circumstance, this would paint Rufus as a somewhat two-dimensional antagonist, arbitrarily doing bad things for bad things' sake. But the way he's been established with a certain coldness, ambiguity, and calm pragmatism make him quite intriguing as a foil to Cloud & Co. over the course of the game, and a neat secondary antagonism when compared to the maniacal, impassioned aims of Sephiroth. Firstly, looking at evidence of Rufus's cold persona, and as we've just mentioned, we have him immediately expressing his distaste for his father's way of doing things, and the fact he shows up without particularly caring his father's just been murdered, and is far more concerned that he's just inherited Shinra Corp, is a testament to his mentality as a somewhat narcissistic upstart and extremely self-assured in the way that he wants to run things. His impromptu inauguration speech to the party further exemplifies this self-indulgence, and rather than being a breath of fresh air or a change of tact for the Shinra, as the party briefly hoped for, we quickly realise that under Rufus's stewardship, things are going to get a whole lot worse. Now, this said, Rufus is certainly ruthless, he's certainly cold, but he's also remarkably pragmatic, as a nemesis, and it adds this appeal to him, I think. Just prior to the one-on-one boss fight with Cloud, for example, Rufus asks him, "Why do you want to fight me?" And this is interesting because it's not the same as saying, "I don't want to fight," and it's not based on sentiment or emotion, it's merely a statement based on his finding it impractical to do so, and shortly thereafter he shrugs and laments that they can't be allies before the battle begins. This scenario plays into the whole ambiguity of Rufus. He mentions himself, he's the one that proposes the prospect of an alliance, and it's periodically mentioned that if he's after Sephiroth, then surely he's a good guy, in keeping with the old proverb, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." And this is given service throughout the series, particularly in Advent Children, where, once again, Cloud finds himself inadvertently aligned with Rufus's agenda in apprehending Kadaj and the Remnants. And this is what provokes discussion among fans as to whether Rufus could be considered an anti-hero, an anti-villain, or perhaps even something of a protagonist by the time the series concludes. Even forgetting Advent Children for a moment, and looking to the events of the main game, Rufus is shown to put himself in harm's way and conduct acts of what many might consider to be heroism, such as calmly organising the defence of Junon, and using the Sister Ray to fend off Diamond Weapon when lesser leaders might have fled to safety. And indeed, Rufus is extremely hands-on in the pursuit of Sephiroth, where others might delegate down to Heidegger, Scarlet or the Turks, which shows a fierce personal drive, ambition, and arguably bravery that contrasts, with others, such as his father. Now, it's an interesting aspect of both Final Fantasy VII and Advent Children as to whether Rufus is acting in some vaguely heroic leadership capacity, or indeed whether it's purely out of self-interest that just happens to coincide with saving the lives of people. Junon, for example, is a formidable outpost and strategic location for Shinra, and the first line of defence for the city of Midgar, where Shinra Towers is based. So encountering Weapon with the Sister Ray, do we suppose Rufus is interested in saving the citizens of Junon, Midgar, and the wider populace? Or is he merely protecting the interests of the company, and by extension himself? Likewise with Advent Children, Rufus is at odds with Kadaj and his brothers, but whether he's trying to ally with Cloud because he wants to protect people, or whether he's simply trying to cure himself and rebuild the Shinra Empire, is again entirely up for debate. There's a fleeting yet significant moment in Advent Children where Cloud meets Rufus face to face, and after a tactful pitch from the latter as to why Cloud should help them, Reno blurts out that together they can rebuild Shinra, prompting Cloud to reject their proposal and leave. This slip of the tongue is a funny moment, particularly as we hear Rufus and Rude's dismay as Cloud leaves. But it's important in framing the idea that Rufus has been quite disingenuous throughout the events of this movie, and has maintained this single-serving purpose of governing Shinra and accumulating power, rather than any true attempt at reform. And he frequently lies about his knowledge of Jenova to both Cloud and Kadaj, although, once again, and much like with the defence of Junon, at the end of Advent Children, we do see an act of heroism from him, confronting Kadaj twice, and confidently plummeting from a building to apprehend him in the process. And I think this is another appealing aspect of Rufus, because regardless of your opinion of him, regardless of whether he's good, bad, or something in between, he's evidently fearless, and over the course of the compilation, we see him confidently facing down Cloud, Weapon, Kadaj, and leading the pursuit of Sephiroth to the Promised Land. And through all of this, he doesn't once lose his cool, or show any outward display of fear, anger, sadness, or any emotion at all. So, as has often been the case with my Final Fantasy character analyses, I like to dip into psychology where relevant, particularly when it helps form a rationale for the aims, intentions and personalities of certain characters. In Rufus's case, I think some of the traits and moments we've touched upon could potentially profile a personality disorder such as MPD, which is generally classified by relentless ambition, self-importance, a lack of empathy, and a need to exert control over others, and an emotional detachment, often as a result of childhood trauma or distress, and underlying genetic conditions. So, regarding the former, and as we've discussed, Rufus is highly ambitious, to the extent that he won't delegate important tasks to the Turks, but rather he wants to be at the forefront of the pursuit of the Promised Land, personally undertaking many of the tasks required to get there, and making the success his own. His self-importance and sense of entitlement is exemplified in numerous ways, such as showing up at Rocket Town to commandeer Sid's tiny Bronco as if it's somehow owed to him, and his subsequent decision to shoot it down when he can't get his hands on it. His lack of empathy and need to exert control over others is displayed in his speech to the party about ruling through fear, and as we've discussed, the emotional detachment is quite self-explanatory through the series by his calm, detached demeanour. However, his conflicted relationship with his father does somewhat allude to an uncomfortable childhood that may have exacerbated this condition to some extent, which is down to interpretation and theory owing to no real evidence offered, in-game about this relationship. Now, all of this said, it's purely conjecture on my part, and these are simply character traits I identified in-game that make me think of a classic narcissistic or psychopathic profile. His pragmatic side, however, such as seeing no value in fighting Cloud and effectively defending Junon, somewhat counters this idea, as narcissists are usually personalities that need to be agreed with and subjected to. Otherwise it prompts an emotional outburst and often fits of rage. Rufus, as we've seen, exhibits no outward emotion at all, so I'm reluctant to defend this disorder theory too thoroughly with him. Furthermore, quite a telling moment in Advent Children is when Kadaj throws Sung and Elena's identification cards at Rufus and asks him whether he'd swear on their lives. The ensuing pause from Rufus is probably the closest thing we get to an emotional response from him over the course of the entire series. But whether it's because he values Sung and Elena as people and as comrades, or whether it's simply because of their skills and aptitudes and potentially the loss of them as tools and agents, is again up for debate in this moment. So, regardless what lies behind Rufus's enigmatic facade, the fact he's never flinched in the face of danger, shown any compassion, or relented in his ambition, makes him an excellent character in this story, and a force to be contended with, second only to the superhuman Sephiroth and the maniacal intelligence of Hojo. So, finally, I'd like to wrap up on Rufus by discussing this long-debated question of whether he's capable of change. Many use Advent Children as evidence that he's attempting true change in his outlook and personality, and many fans argue that perhaps contracting geostigma and facing his own mortality has proved a humbling experience. For my part, while I think it's possible, I'm still sceptical that this is the case. Throughout the film, Rufus is seen to lie numerous times to both Cloud and Kadaj about his intentions and the location of Mother, or Genova. The latter is understandable, but his inclination to lie to a proven freedom fighter like Cloud gives the impression that he has ulterior motives, and he's still very apt and willing to manipulate people. Reno's slip of the tongue also contributes to the idea that Rufus has self-preservation and the rebuilding of Shinra as the true purpose, and while Rufus's aims in the movie do align to Cloud's, it doesn't necessarily make him a good person with good intentions. The later events of Dirge of Cerberus do, however, incline towards an idea that Rufus has reformed, or at least felt accountable for the past actions of himself and the Shinra, because while he's not seen in the game, it's heavily alluded to that he is the mystery benefactor and financier of Reeve's World Regenesis organization, which exists to right the wrongs of the world in the wake of Shinra and rebuild a more sustainable planet for everyone. Once again, it's a subtlety of the game that gives no real closure to Rufus's story or detail about his transition from reckless, ambitious upstart to financier and volunteer to a planet protection society. But needless to say, looking back to before Crisis, we've seen instances of Rufus funding freedom fighters before, ultimately to encourage and pursue his own agenda. And once again, we could interpret in any number of ways what this might mean, in lieu of clarity from the story. Do we really suppose the ruthless and ambitious Rufus of old has changed his tune? After all, what's the harm in publicly funding an organisation if you genuinely endorse it and want to be seen to be allied to it? Unless, of course, you plan on subverting it somehow, somewhere down the line. Is it perhaps more plausible that he's merely maintaining influence with the powers that be, opportunistically biding his time, but ensuring that he never strays too far from those in control? It's an interesting question for an interesting character, and a nice point to conclude on, I think. So, wrapping up, Rufus is an excellent and decidedly discreet and secretive force within the sprawling story of Final Fantasy VII. Fearless, ambiguous, and driven, he's an excellent foe and incidental ally that exited the series in much the same fashion as he entered, suddenly and shrouded in mystery,